The north is cold and full of whispers.
Robert Baratheon had to duck to enter the crypts. The corridor was built for Starks, and the Starks were tall people, but not tall in the way Robert was tall. He was wide, too, had always been wide, muscle first, then later the weight that had settled across his chest and belly, over years of feasting and drinking and refusing to move as much as he once had. The stone caught his pauldron on the left side. He swore under his breath and kept moving. He had sent his torchbearer back at the entrance. He didn't want company for this. The crypts went deep. Each step down pulled the cold tighter around him, the stone leaching warmth from the air with a patience that only stone possesses. The torch he carried himself through uneven shadows across the lined faces of dead Starks, kings and lords stretching back 8,000 years, their stone eyes fixed on nothing, their hands folded over the hilts of iron swords. The Starks put those swords there to keep the spirits from walking. Robert had never asked Ned whether he actually believed that. He had never asked Ned a lot of things. He found her near the back. The statue was simple. No elaborate stone throne, no carved battle scene, no inscription of victories. Lyanna Stark, daughter of Rickard, had been given a still face and hands folded at her waist around a carved stone rose. The sculptor had given her peace she might not have possessed in life, the peace of cold rock. Robert stood in front of it for a long time and said nothing at all. He reached inside his riding glove and pulled out a feather. Gray, small, a raven's feather he had found in the yard that morning and pocketed without examining why. He set it at the base of the statue. He took his hand away slowly. 17 years. He had loved her the way young men love things they cannot keep. Completely, without reason, in a way that had never once transferred to anything else. Not to the crown. Not to the victories. Not to Cersei, who was beautiful and cold and who he had married as the price of winning a war. Lyanna had been warm. She had argued with him. She had laughed at him when he deserved to be laughed at, which was often, and she had never pretended otherwise for the sake of his pride. She had been promised to him, and then she had been gone, and the version of Robert Baratheon that might have been the man she deserved had gone into the ground beside her. He breathed in the cold. He breathed it out. Then he turned and walked back up into the light. Ned presented the household in the outer yard. The whole procession of it was formal. Catelyn beside him, composed in dark gray wool, the children arrayed in descending order of age. Robb first, already tall at 14, Tully red in his coloring, but enough Stark in the jaw to satisfy the North. Sansa, 11, holding herself with a deliberateness that had not been there a year ago. Arya, 9, visibly fighting her own feet for the right to stay still. Bran, 7, who had been warned about climbing twice since breakfast. And Rickon, too young to understand ceremony, gripping his nursemaid's hand and staring at the horses. Robert moved through them quickly, the way he moved through formal things, present but restless, his attention already casting ahead. A word for Robb, a smile for Sansa that made her flush, a booming noise at Arya that startled her into almost laughing. Then Ned said, quietly, "And my ward Jon Snow," and Robert's eyes found the boy standing slightly apart from the true-born children. He stopped. Jon was standing in the correct position for what he was, slightly back, slightly to the side, the precise amount of space that convention assigned to a baseborn son at a formal presentation. Hands clasped behind him, chin level, not trying to disappear and not trying to be seen. And his face was her face. Not entirely. The Stark bone structure was strong in him, the long jaw, the gray eyes, the quality of stillness the Stark children all carried to varying degrees. But something else lived beneath it. The way he held himself. The sense of a person watching everything from behind a surface that was controlled rather than empty. Robert had known exactly one other person who could stand in a crowded yard and look as though she were somewhere quieter. He crossed to the boy without deciding to. Jon Snow did not step back. He did not look down. He met Robert's gaze with gray eyes that gave away nothing and said, "Your Grace," with a courtesy that was not performance, a boy who had learned his manners and kept them without ornament. Robert looked at him for a long time. Then he laughed. The big, cracking sound of it bounced off the stone walls and turned 3 horses' heads, and it was a laugh with something broken running through the center of it that only Ned, watching from 3 feet away, would have been able to name. "The Stark look," Robert said, to no one in particular, still looking at the boy. "Gods, Ned, you make them to type, don't you?" Jon said nothing to this. He waited, gray and still. The feast that night was loud with southern voices, and the particular energy that settles into a great hall when a king is present and everyone performs their gladness for him. Robert stood, the hall quieted in a spreading wave from the high table outward, cup by cup, voice by voice, until the only sounds were fire and wind and the distant complaint of a dog somewhere below the floor. He had not prepared remarks. He never prepared remarks. "The boy Jon comes south with us," he said. "A ward of the crown, a companion to my sons." Catelyn Stark's hands stilled on the table, not a flinch. She was too controlled for flinching, but a specific stillness, the stillness of a woman receiving unexpectedly favorable news and immediately calculating its cost. Across from her, Robb's hand found Jon's arm under the table. A grip. Not a word. Cersei Lannister, 3 seats from Robert, lifted her wine and drank. Over the rim of the cup, her eyes found Jon across the length of the table. They did not harden, they simply measured. She was adding something up. At the far end of the high table, a man sat with his cup untouched and his back straight. Stannis Baratheon, Robert's younger brother and Lord of Dragonstone, had not returned to his seat on Blackwater Bay since Jon Arryn died 3 weeks ago. He had remained at court without stated explanation, occupying his position on the small council with the grim tenacity of a man who had decided to be present for something he had not yet found. He was looking at Jon now, not with Robert's warmth or Cersei's calculation. With the flat, assessing gaze of someone filing information, Jon sat in the noise of the hall's approval, the raised cups, the polite applause, the murmuring of lords performing their pleasure for a king who was watching, and kept his face empty, his hands flat on the table. He thought about nothing until there was enough distance to think about everything. Ned cornered Robert in his solar before the candles had burned halfway. Robert was still in his feast clothes and still drinking, though he had moved from the arbor red to something darker. He was standing when Ned arrived, which meant he had been expecting this and had decided to have it on his feet. Ned gave him 3 reasons. He said Jon was settled in the north and knew no other life. He said a bastard ward elevated to the crown's household would invite questions about precedent. He said Jon was young and King's Landing did not treat young men gently. He did not say, "This boy is Lyanna's son, and every moment he spends inside your city is a moment someone clever might look at his face and start asking questions. I have spent 14 years making sure no one asks." Robert listened to all 3 with the patience of a man who had already decided and was waiting for the argument to finish. Then he set down his cup. "You gave him a bastard's name," Robert said, "and you hid him in the north where the cold and the gray could keep him small." He picked the cup back up. "I'm giving him a future. Robert, he comes south, Ned." Not loud, quieter than loud, which was worse, the voice Robert used when he had finished arguing and started deciding. "I won't have that boy spend another year at the edge of someone else's table." His eyes were steady and a little sad and entirely immovable. "He comes with us." There was nothing Ned could say that did not require saying everything. He yielded. Jon was in the Godswood before dawn. He went there when he could not sleep, which was often, and the weirwood tree did not require anything from him. Its carved face bled slow red sap into the dark and kept the silence that the old gods had always kept. No demands, no ceremony, just the cold and the dark and the sound of the forest breathing. Ned found him there, or knew to look there. It did not matter which. They sat for a while without speaking. The red eyes of the tree looked past them both. Then Ned said without preamble, "Whatever Robert sees in you, whatever he decides you are to him, be careful not to let him see all of you." A pause. "Some things are safer in shadow." Jon looked at him. His father's face was unreadable in the dark. "What does he see?" "Something he lost," Ned said. "A long time ago." Jon held that, filed it in the place he kept things he didn't yet understand, which had always been a large place and was lately growing. After a moment quietly, "Will you tell me what you haven't told me? Someday." The weirwood bled. The forest breathed. "Someday," Ned said. "When you're ready." A beat. "When I am." The caravan assembled in the dark before dawn. 300 people and their horses, their wagons, their banners and purposes. Torchlight turning the snow amber. The cold sharp enough to feel like something meant. Jon found his place in the column and mounted and did not let himself look for Robb, who had said goodbye an hour ago in the yard and had not cried and had gripped Jon's shoulder until it would bruise. He looked back at Winterfell once. The gray walls, the forge smoke rising thin and pale, the dark canopy of the Godswood above the battlements, the weirwood just visible against a sky going lighter at its edges. He looked forward. He did not look back again. The land changed south of the neck. Jon had never been below the neck. The north was the only world he had known, gray and cold and honest about both, the sky close to the ground, the trees old enough to remember things. Below the neck, the sky opened differently. The trees were different species, the air carried different moisture, and the road, the same King's Road running straight and Roman carved through the continent, felt like a different road, as if the name were the only thing it shared with the one that ran north of Moat Cailin. He watched it all from the saddle and said nothing about any of it. Robert rode beside him on the third morning out, abandoning the royal wheelhouse, which he hated, which smelled of Cersei's perfume, which was not where he wanted to be, for the saddle and the open road and Jon's company. This had become the pattern within the first week. Robert in the wheelhouse for the official morning departure, Robert beside Jon by the time the column had found its pace. Nobody commented on it, nobody would. He told stories. This was what Robert did when he was happy. The stories came out chronologically disordered, pulled from different years, assembled around whatever feeling he wanted to communicate, rather than any narrative logic. The rebellion, mostly. The battles. Stony Sept. The Trident. The time he and Ned had gotten drunk in a tavern in Gulltown the night before a council meeting that Jon Arryn had been furious about. Jon listened. He was an excellent listener, which Robert interpreted as wisdom, and which was also, though Jon did not examine this, his primary mechanism for managing situations he did not yet understand. He did not speak until he knew enough. He rarely knew enough. "You don't talk much," Robert said. On the fourth day, observation, not criticism. "I'm learning," Jon said. Robert looked at him sideways. "Learning what? What questions are worth asking?" Robert was quiet for a moment. Then he laughed, the short version of the big laugh, the one that meant something had surprised him. He did not say anything further about it, but he kept riding beside Jon, and the stories kept coming, and Jon kept listening. And somewhere in the second week, the column's social geography shifted in a way that everyone noticed, and no one named. The king's ward rode at the king's side, and the men who rode near the king adjusted their positions accordingly. Tyrion Lannister found Jon on the 7th day. He had been intending to visit the Wall. This was a fact Jon established in the first few minutes of their acquaintance, because Tyrion offered it immediately, not defensively, but with the transparency of a man who had nothing to hide about his own motivations and found concealment tedious. He had wanted to see the Wall his entire adult life. He had finally arranged to come north, had been in the column heading to Winterfell with that specific purpose, and had spent 48 hours reconsidering. "The Wall will still be there," Tyrion said. He was on a small, sensible horse that suited him in every way his brother's destrier did not. "It's been there for 8,000 years. Another few months won't trouble it? And me?" Jon said. "You," Tyrion said, "are considerably more interesting than 8,000 years of ice, and considerably less permanent. One of these things is worth prioritizing." He shifted in his saddle. "Besides, I've read everything about the Wall that can be read. I know its measurements, its history, its garrison. You I cannot read in advance. That makes you the better investment." Jon looked at him. Tyrion was watching the road ahead with the expression of a man who had made a decision and found it satisfactory, which Jon was beginning to understand was what contentment looked like on Tyrion's face. "Thank you," Jon said. "Don't. It's entirely self-interested." Their conversations covered the road from the Neck to the Trident in installments. Tyrion talked about King's Landing the way a physician talked about a patient, with complete familiarity and zero illusion. He described the small council's power flows, the way information moved through the Red Keep, and who moved it, which corridors were watched, and by whom. He described Littlefinger as a man who collected debt, Varys as a man who collected secrets, and Pycelle as a man who collected other people's conversations and filed them under Lannister. "And the Queen?" Jon asked. "My sister," Tyrion said with the particular flatness of a man selecting accurate words carefully, "is the most capable person in King's Landing. I say this without admiration. She is capable the way a siege weapon is capable, impressive and devastating, and entirely without interest in collateral damage. Should I be afraid of her? You should be accurate about her." Tyrion glanced at him. "Fear makes you predictable. Accuracy makes you useful." He paused. "The difference matters." Jon filed that alongside the other things Tyrion had said that were going to take time to fully unpack. The hunt happened near the inn at the crossroads. The column had stopped for 2 days at the largest way station on the King's Road, A rest for horses and people, a chance for the outriders to sweep the road ahead, a chance for Robert to drink too much, which he did. On the morning of the second day, a hunting party rode out into the nearby forest. Jon went with the main party, not as a hunter. He had no assigned role in the hunt, but because Robert had gestured him into the column with the casual authority of a man who assumed Jon would want to come. The kill came from a stag driven by the beaters toward the clearing where the hunters waited. 3 arrows went at it near simultaneously, from Robert, from a knight called Ser Lyle, and from Jon, who had drawn without thinking, the reflex of a boy raised in the north who had been hunting since he could hold a bow and had a clean shot in front of him. The stag dropped. 2 arrows were in it. One was Robert's and one was Jon's. Ser Lyle's had gone wide. Robert crouched over the animal with the expression of a man conducting a scientific inquiry. He looked at the 2 arrows for a long time. He looked at Jon. Northern technique, Robert said. He was not looking at the arrows anymore. He was looking at Jon's grip on the bow, the way he'd planted his feet. He said it the way a man who had been a warrior spoke about technique, like a language he had grown up in. Lower release point. Clean. The squires and junior knights had gathered the way they always gathered when the king was paying attention to something. The attention of the king created its own gravity. Joffrey was among them. Robert stood and clapped Jon's shoulder with the open hand of a man conferring something without meaning to confer it, and said loudly enough for the clearing to hear, "The North remembers how to hunt." He was already moving toward the stag with the head huntsman, already occupying himself with the next thing the way Robert always occupied himself. He had said what he meant and moved on. The clearing was quiet for a moment that lasted the exact length of a thing being registered. Jon did not look at Joffrey. He did not need to. He could feel the specific quality of what was happening behind him. He had grown up in a house where he understood what it meant to be looked at and found insufficient. And he knew the temperature of that gaze on the back of his neck. He went to help with the stag. Arya found him that night at the fire's edge, long after the camp had settled. She had escaped her minder again. She always escaped her minder. Jon had stopped being surprised by this 2 days out of Winterfell. She dropped beside him without ceremony, cross-legged, her dark hair loose, and looked at the fire with the particular expression she wore when something was bothering her, and she had decided to be direct about it. "Do you want to go?" she said. Jon looked at the fire. He had been asking himself this since the gods wood in Winterfell, since the moment Ned had said some things are safer in shadow, and he had not arrived at an answer that felt complete. "Does it matter what I want?" he said. "It should." Her voice was certain in the way Arya's voice was certain, without qualification, without the hedge that people added when they were not sure of their ground. Jon said nothing for a moment. "I'm going to miss you," he said, because it was true and there was no point in not saying it. Arya leaned against his shoulder. She didn't say anything back. She didn't need to. They sat at the fire until her minder came looking, and Jon went to bed, and the King's Road unrolled southward in the dark ahead of them, leading toward a city that was already becoming real. The smell arrived before the city did. Still a mile out on the King's Road, with the walls barely visible through the morning haze, it found them, a rich, dense, complicated wrongness that was not one smell, but many layered on top of each other without apology. Tanneries, fishmongers, the sweet rotten perfume of an open sewer emptying somewhere toward the Blackwater, smoke from 100,000 cook fires, animals, people. The accumulated effluent of 500,000 lives being lived in close proximity with inadequate drainage. Jon kept his face still. The column moved toward the King's Gate and the city opened in front of them like something wounded. The walls first, higher than anything at Winterfell, higher than anything Jon had tried to imagine when he had tried to imagine them. Dark stone, patched with limestone where repairs had been made, watched by guards who stood at spacing intervals and looked at the procession with the boredom of men who had watched many processions. Then the gate itself, wide enough for 6 horses abreast, and then the city. Jon had lived his entire life in a castle of 3,000 people. King's Landing had 500,000. The noise hit him in the gate's shadow and kept hitting him as they emerged onto the street. A continuous layered sound that was nothing like Winterfell's single-note bustle. It had factions in it. Hawkers over here, an argument there. Children, horses, chickens, the metal ring of a blacksmith 3 streets over, carts grinding on cobblestones, someone laughing at a volume that suggested they did not care what laughing cost them. Jon rode through it and watched everything and showed nothing. Above it all, rising from the hill at the city's center on a platform of red stone, the Red Keep. Its towers caught the morning sun and threw it back in the color of old blood. Jon tipped his head back slightly to take in the full height of it, and did not let himself react to how large it was, and noticed that Joffrey, 2 horses ahead of him, had not bothered to look at it at all. Some places became ordinary if you lived inside them long enough. Jon filed this thought where he kept things that would be useful later. The chamberlain assigned to find Jon's quarters was a thin man named Renly, who had served the Red Keep for 30 years, and had therefore encountered every possible permutation of complicated person, but who was visibly uncertain about this particular one. The ward of the king, a base-born boy whose name was still Snow but who had been publicly claimed by Robert as companion to the princes. Renly had protocols for wards, he had protocols for bastards. He did not have protocols for whatever Jon Snow was, and this bothered him in the specific way that gaps in protocol always bothered men who lived by them. He gave Jon rooms in the East Residential Wing, 3 doors from Tommen's apartments, 2 floors below the royal chambers. A position of some honor, Renly explained carefully. "Thank you," Jon said. Renly hovered. He was waiting for something, a complaint, a demand, some indication of what this boy expected from his circumstances. Jon looked at the room. Stone, like every room in every castle he had ever been in. The furniture was finer than his room at Winterfell. The hangings newer, the fireplace large enough to walk into. A window faced east over a lower roof, and beyond it, a slice of the city below. Terracotta rooftops running down to the Blackwater, smoke rising from a dozen sources at once. He set his pack down. "Will that be all?" Renly asked. "Yes, thank you." He waited until the door had closed and the footsteps had faded, and the corridor outside had gone quiet. Then he stood in the middle of the room in the cold hearth smell of a fire not yet lit, and felt the specific quality of being alone in a strange place while surrounded by more people than he had ever been surrounded by in his life. He had grown up in Catelyn Tully's house. He knew the exact shape of that particular kind of alone. He built the fire himself rather than ring for a servant. He had time, and he wanted something to do with his hands. Cersei Lannister came on the afternoon of the 2nd day. She did not announce herself far in advance. A page appeared at Jon's door an hour before she did, then a lady's maid who inspected the room, then Cersei herself in a gown the color of Lannister crimson, her golden hair arranged with the kind of precision that required 2 hours and looked like it required none. She was extraordinarily beautiful and knew it so completely that she no longer needed to use it. It simply existed, like the height of the keep's walls, present and structural. She sat in the chair by the fire. Jon sat across from her. "I thought we should speak," she said, with a warmth that was perfect. "You've had little chance to settle, and the court can be overwhelming for someone arriving from—" a small pause, gracious, not unkind, quieter circumstances. "You're kind, Your Grace. Lord Stark speaks very highly of you." She watched his face when she said father. He gave her nothing. He must be glad to have family nearby. "I expect so. King's Landing must feel very different from Winterfell." "It smells different," Jon said. She laughed. A real laugh, brief, surprised, and something behind her eyes recalibrated while her expression held its warmth. "It does," she agreed. "You grow accustomed to it." A pause that felt easy and was not. "You never knew your mother, I understand." "No, Your Grace. A hard thing for a boy." Her voice was soft, genuinely soft, or the best performance of genuine softness Jon had encountered, and he had spent 14 years watching Catelyn Tully be warmly furious about his existence. "Do you know anything of her?" "She was from the north," Jon said. "She's gone. There's not much more than that." Cersei looked at him steadily. He looked back. He kept his hands still in his lap and his breathing even, and his face in the arrangement that Ned had once called his listening face, attentive without offering anything. The warmth in her eyes did not cool, but something behind it sharpened, a needle-point adjustment too small for anyone watching to name. She had expected simpler material. "You must find the training yard," she said, already moving on, her voice smooth as the transition cost her nothing. "My son Joffrey so enjoys a good sparring partner. I think you'll get on." She rose. Jon rose with her. "I do hope you'll be comfortable here. If you need anything at all, you need only ask." "Thank you, Your Grace." She left. The room felt different after she had gone, the way rooms do when something that was measuring them has moved on. Jon sat back down. He thought about the way she had watched his face when she said mother. He thought about the way the warmth had sharpened without changing, a knife that looked identical before and after it was drawn. He thought about Catelyn Tully, about how he had spent years being managed by a woman who wanted him small and out of the way, and about how he had survived that, which meant he understood something useful about it. He built the fire up a little higher and kept his face still even though no one was watching, because it was better practice that way. Joffrey found him on the third evening, 2 boys with him, lordlings of 12 and 13, put together in the southern fashion, velvet doublets, expressions practiced in the mirror. Joffrey himself was 12, golden-haired, already carrying in his face the high cheekbones and thin mouth that would be called handsome in a decade if he smiled differently. He was not smiling now. He had planted his feet 3 feet away. A performance for an audience of 2. "Snow," he said. Jon stopped. He waited. "You understand how this works?" Joffrey's tone was almost reasonable, the tone of a boy explaining something he had decided it was generous of him to explain. "My father does things on impulse. He always has. He'll be interested in you for a while. He likes novelty, and you're novel. A small gesture, almost elegant. Then he won't be. And then you'll be what you are. A bastard in a castle full of people with actual names. A slight tilt of the head. I'm explaining this so you know, so there isn't any confusion about your position here." Jon looked at him for a moment. "My lord," Jon said. He stepped around Joffrey. A berth of perhaps 2 feet, unhurried, not aggressive, not apologetic, the way he moved through a practice yard when something was in his path, cleanly, without unnecessary contact. He kept walking. Behind him, a pause. Then one of the 2 lordlings made a sound, half a laugh, swallowed badly. Then the other, and the thing they were laughing at was not Jon. He rounded the corner and the corridor took him, and he did not look back. The castle sept was empty at the hour he found it. Stone floor, stone walls, candles burning low before the 7-faced altar, the smell of old incense and cold wick. Jon had no particular use for the 7. The gods of his blood were older and lived in trees. But he sat in the front pew because the sept was quiet and he needed to think without being interrupted. He laid out what he had. Robert's love first. Real? The king was not a subtle man, and what showed on his face in Jon's presence was not performance, but real did not mean reliable. Robert was erratic and drank too much, and could be redirected by anyone who understood the specific gravity of his grief. What looked like love from the inside of it could look like distraction from the outside, and Cersei had been working with that distraction for years. Ned, present, the hand of the king, the most trustworthy protector Jon would ever have, also temporary. The hand chip had a horizon Jon could not see yet, but Ned was not built for King's Landing, and they both knew it. Tyrion's knowledge, offered freely on the road south. Tyrion was clever and kind in the way that clever and isolated people were kind, genuine in its own way, and also strategic in its own way. Not to be distrusted, to be understood for what it was. And then the last thing, the thing Cersei had probed for and not found. The thing Joffrey had already named as his primary weapon, the bastard name, the gap in standing, the nowhere place between ward and trueborn that anyone in this court could push against whenever it suited them. Jon sat with that for a while. He thought about the corridor, what Joffrey had said, and what he had not said back. He thought about Cersei's needlepoint recalibration, the moment she understood she had been given less to work with than she expected. He thought about Tyrion asking on the road, "What do you want from King's Landing?" and Jon not having an answer. He had one now. Not recognition, not the things that people in this city fought each other half to death for every day, mistaking the fighting for the purpose. He wanted to understand it. All of it. Every power and every lie, and everything that was pretending to be something it was not. He wanted to understand King's Landing the way he understood a practice yard, which pieces were structural and which were performance, which attacks were committed and which were feints, which opponents were genuinely dangerous and which were only loud. He would survive this city the same way he had survived Winterfell. He would watch more than he spoke. He would give away nothing until the ground was right. He sat in the sept until the candles burned lower. Then he rose and went to bed, and for the first time since the King's Gate, he slept without difficulty. The yard was empty before first light. Jon had found this out on his 3rd morning in the keep, that the training yard in that specific hour before dawn belonged to no one, that the torches had been doused and not yet relit, that the master-at-arms did not arrive until the 6th bell, that the squires and pages and lordlings who used the space at all hours of the day simply did not come here in the dark. He had started coming in the dark because of this, because the pre-dawn had always been his hour at Winterfell, the hour before anyone else was awake to remind him what he was, and he saw no reason to surrender it just because the stone around him had changed. He drilled footwork first, always footwork. Sir Roderick Cassel had said it so many times that it had become internal. The feet are the fight, boy, your hands are just finishing it. Jon moved through forms in the torchless yard, stepping and pivoting on flagstones slick with the morning's cold, his breath misting in the dark, the wooden practice sword leaving nothing behind but the soft percussion of its cuts, and the muscle memory being written into him stroke by stroke. He did not know for the first 2 weeks that he was being watched. Sir Barristan Selmy came to the yard the way very old knights sometimes came to yards, not to train himself, not with any visible purpose, just present, standing against the far wall with his hands clasped at the small of his back, and his eyes moving with the patient attention of a man for whom assessment had become so natural it had stopped feeling like effort. He had served 3 kings. He had stood in rooms with Arthur Dane and Oswell Went. He had watched fighters all his life with the specific absorption of someone who understood, at a cellular level, what the body could do and what could not be taught to it. He watched Jon Snow in the pre-dawn and said nothing for 14 days. The sparring with Joffrey was Robert's idea. He announced it at breakfast with the satisfaction of a man who had solved a problem elegantly, in front of the king's small party. Ned, 2 household knights, Jaime Lannister, who had been summoned for the morning report, and was still holding a cup of something steaming. "The boys need to spar," Robert said, gesturing between Jon and Joffrey with a piece of bread. "Tournament season's coming. High time they showed what they're made of." Joffrey had gone very still in the way he went still when something was being done to him without his consent. Jon had said nothing. Jaime had set down his cup. The yard filled quickly that morning. Word traveled through the Red Keep with the speed that interesting things always travel, page to squire to lady's maid to steward, and suddenly there were 50 people finding reasons to occupy the gallery and the yard's edges when the 2 boys took their positions. The wooden practice swords were standard issue, 3 pounds each, the weight that taught correct form without the consequence of steel. Barristan stood against the wall to the left. Jaime stood at Robert's shoulder. Joffrey attacked first. He always attacked first. It was the one combat instinct he possessed. That forward motion, that aggression, though the aggression was the only part of the action that came from genuine feeling, and the technique was borrowed and imperfectly remembered. His first swing was high, committed, thrown from the shoulder with his weight behind it. Jon moved his head 8 inches to the right. Barristan saw it first. The evasion was minimal, exactly as minimal as it needed to be. No more, nothing wasted. A boy who had been taught to do only what the situation required, and had learned the lesson well enough that economy had become instinct. He watched the arc of Joffrey's swing finish through empty air, and watched Jon's feet reset beneath him in the same breath, the weight transferring to the back foot in preparation, and thought, this one was taught by someone who understood the difference between training and fighting. Joffrey swung again, and again. The pattern was visible to anyone with eyes, increasing speed, decreasing precision, the frustration of the misbuilding and converting itself directly into the next attack, rather than being processed. Jon absorbed all of it by not being where the sword arrived. He moved backward, laterally, diagonally, the footwork from the pre-dawn drills doing exactly what footwork was designed to do, and gave Joffrey nothing to hit. Jaime watched from the right and felt something he did not choose to feel. The cold note of it. This boy was going to be exceptional. Not in 5 years. He was already exceptional, already operating at a level that had nothing to do with age, and in 5 years he was going to be the best blade in this yard by a distance that would become embarrassing to everyone else in it, including conceivably Jaime himself in a decade when certain things that were currently maintained would begin to require more effort. He watched Jon let Joffrey's stamina run for 40 seconds, and then watched Jon decide. The decision was visible if you knew how to read it, a slight lowering of the back shoulder, a shift of intent in the eyes, something in the quality of Jon's stillness that changed by a degree no observer without Jaime's experience would have caught. Then Jon stepped inside Joffrey's guard on the next forward swing, not away from it, the counterintuitive direction, and his free hand took Joffrey's sword wrist and turned it. And the practice sword described a clean arc through the air and landed on the flagstones 12 feet away. Joffrey stood with an empty hand. Jon stepped back. He was not breathing hard. The yard was quiet for a moment that lasted the exact duration of something significant being absorbed. Then Robert Baratheon put his head back and laughed. The full force of it, the bell-crack laugh that had always sounded more like a warhammer than a human sound. And he pointed at Joffrey with the blunt finger of a man who had just won a private argument with himself. "There," he said. "That is what footwork looks like, boy. You're fighting with your arms." Jon fought with his feet. He crossed the yard in 4 strides and put his hand on Jon's shoulder, and the weight of it was the weight of a large man's approval, which was considerable. "Jaime," he called, without turning. "This boy will have your head inside a decade." Jaime's expression did not change. "Very possibly, Your Grace." "Not possibly, certainly." Robert shook Jon once, firmly, and released him. He was already moving back toward the gallery, already re-engaging with the morning, the moment complete in his mind. Jon stood in the yard and looked at no one in particular. The squires and pages had begun to murmur. Someone said his name once, and then someone else said it, and it moved through the gallery's edges in the particular way that names move when they acquire a different weight. Joffrey picked up his practice sword from the ground. He did not look at Jon. He walked off the yard without speaking. Barristan requested the private session 3 days later. He framed it as a matter of technique refinement. The ward of the king deserved personal attention from the Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, which was unarguable. Jon came to the east yard at the hour specified and found Barristan already there in full white armor, which was a statement of some kind. They trained for an hour. Barristan corrected things that Ser Roderick had not caught. Small things, deep things, the kind of refinement that only surfaces after the fundamentals are already sound. Jon received each correction and incorporated it without comment and ran the corrected movement twice before moving on, and Barristan noted this and said nothing about it. Then, without obvious transition, Barristan said Prince Rhaegar used to throw his weight into the extension differently than most, forward and slightly down, rather than forward and level. He demonstrated with a slow half-speed swing. It looks like it opens the left shoulder, and most opponents move to exploit that. The shoulder wasn't actually open. A pause. It took a skilled fighter to understand that before the blade was already past them. Jon watched the demonstration. "Try it," Barristan said. Jon did. The first attempt was approximate, the second was closer. On the third, something in his arm seemed to find it, a groove in the movement that received the technique the way a lock receives its key, without conflict. He completed the swing and held the follow-through. Barristan was very still. He was looking at Jon with an expression that he had composed carefully, and that was, despite that composure, doing something with his eyes that Jon could not name. Not grief, not recognition exactly, or not recognition of a person. Recognition of something less specific and more unnerving. Like a man hearing a melody he had not heard in years, and could not quite place the source of. "Good," Barristan said. The word was even and revealed nothing. Again, he did not mention Rhaegar for the remainder of the session. But when they finished and Jon was walking back toward the keep, Jon heard Barristan stand in the empty yard for a long moment before following. He did not look back. Jaime found him at dusk in the corridor outside the armory. Not a public corridor. Jaime had chosen it. Jon stopped and waited, and Jaime stood in his white cloak with his golden hair in the evening light and looked at Jon with a frankness that was neither friendly nor hostile, the look of a man who had decided to say a true thing for his own reasons and wanted credit for neither the truth nor the reason. "You fought well this morning," Jaime said. "Thank you. The yard isn't the court." Jon held that for a moment. "I know." "You know it," Jaime said. "The way you know a thing someone's told you. You don't know it yet the way you know footwork. The difference matters here." He tilted his head slightly. "In the yard you beat Joffrey and Robert loved you for it, and 50 people saw. In the court, the things that happen to you happen in corridors, in letters, in a word in the right ear at the right feast. No one sees, no one announces." He let that settle. Being the best fighter in King's Landing is a wonderful thing to be. It won't protect you from King's Landing. Jon looked at him. "Why are you telling me this?" Something moved across Jaime's face. Quick, complex, gone. "Because it's true," he said. "And true things should be said occasionally. Keeps the practice from atrophying." He stepped back. "Sleep well." He walked away down the corridor, the white cloak turning the corner, and Jon stood in the armory doorway with the cool iron smell coming off the room behind him and thought about the specific quality of Jaime Lannister's voice when he had said the word corridors. He thought about Cersei. He thought about the needlepoint recalibration. He thought about 50 people murmuring his name in the gallery. He went inside and sharpened his practice sword for 20 minutes before he realized what he was doing and put the whetstone down. The sword was wood. It did not need sharpening. He went to bed and lay awake for a while, listening to King's Landing breathe outside his window. The tournament had been Robert's idea. He had announced it the way he announced things he wanted, loudly, at a feast, without consulting anyone about the cost. A tournament of the hand, in Ned's honor, open to knights across the realm. Robert had the broad grin of a man who had just given himself a present and called it a gift to someone else. Ned had objected to the expense. Robert had not heard the objection in any meaningful sense. Littlefinger had heard it very clearly. Lord Petyr Baelish, master of coin, had appeared at Ned's elbow the next morning with the numbers already arranged. 40,000 gold dragons, funded by loans from sources he did not name but whose patience he guaranteed. He said it with the smooth pleasure of a man who had been waiting for exactly this kind of reckless royal whim to make himself useful. Robert got his tournament. Littlefinger got his debt arrangements. The crown got 40,000 gold dragons deeper into a hole it did not know how wide it was. The grounds were set up on the flat land south of the Gate of the Gods, a half-hour's ride from the city. By the morning of the first day, the field had been transformed into something that existed to be looked at. Pavilions in house colors stretching along the eastern edge, the lists running north to south with fresh white railing, the stands built in tiers and already half-filled before the first bell. Banners everywhere, stag, lion, direwolf, rose, sun, all the houses that had sent delegations to the capital flying in the morning wind off the Blackwater. Jon rode in with the household party and said nothing about any of it, because the scale of it made his mouth go slightly dry, and he had no interest in letting that show. He entered the squire's melee under Jon of Winterfell. This was Ned's arrangement, made quietly and without explanation in the manner of things Ned did when he had decided something was right and did not want to argue about it. A bastard's name on a tournament roll was a distraction. Jon of Winterfell was simply a northern boy with no house, which was unremarkable in a melee that included lordlings from a dozen holds who had sent their least favored sons south for the seasoning. No one paid attention to him in the marshalling area. He was mid-height, dark-haired, still-faced, wearing practice leathers rather than the embossed tournament kit most of the others had arrived in. Two boys near him made remarks to each other that he heard and did not respond to. He found his position in the marshalling area and watched the other entrants instead. 23 of them. He had done this already. Identified them, assessed them, filed them. 14 were tournament boys, trained for the performance of fighting rather than fighting itself, which revealed itself in the way they held their practice swords and in what they did with their offhands when they were standing still. 4 were genuinely dangerous, a Tyrell squire with excellent footwork, a Lannister boy who was heavier than his age warranted and knew how to use it, and 2 brothers from the Westerlands whose coordination suggested they had trained together for years and would try to use that in the melee. 4 were unknowns. One was Joffrey, who had entered because Robert had suggested it and who was standing 20 feet away in tournament kit that cost more than most of the other entrants' horses, surrounded by attendants, not looking at Jon. The horn sounded. The melee was not a joust. There was no ceremony to it, no heralds calling names, no formal acknowledgement of individual bouts. It was controlled chaos on a marked ground. Wooden swords, no shields, last man standing or last man on his feet, refereed by 3 knights on horseback at the perimeter, who would call a yield if someone went down and couldn't rise. Jon moved toward the center, and then stopped being in the center. This was the first principle. The middle of a melee was where momentum came from multiple directions at once, where a blow from behind was most likely, where the instinct to swing at whoever was closest caused the most confusion. He found the edge of the action instead, and let the action come to him. The first 2 minutes were the tournament boys eliminating each other. This always happened. They had been trained to impress observers, which meant large movements, committed attacks, energy spent on visible things rather than efficient things. Jon watched 3 of them go down in the first 90 seconds and felt the field contract around the survivors. The Lannister boy came for him first among the genuinely dangerous ones, which was correct tactics. Jon was not obviously large and had not yet done anything, which made him look like a reasonable target to clear. He was strong. The first exchange established that clearly, the weight of his swing driving Jon's guard back an inch further than expected. Jon reset, noted the weight, and stopped trying to meet it directly. He let the next swing go wide, stepped in behind it, and struck the Lannister boy twice in the ribs from close quarters before the boy could recover his guard. The third strike went to the back of the knee. He went down. The Tyrell squire was better. He read Jon's footwork after 2 exchanges and adjusted, which meant he was thinking rather than reacting, which made him dangerous in a different way. They circled for a moment that drew attention from the stands. Jon could hear the murmur of it without being able to hear the words. the crowd registering that something patient was happening in the south corner of the ground. The Tyrell squire tried a bind, attempting to trap Jon's blade and turn it. Jon let the bind happen and used the moment of contact to step sideways rather than back, breaking the angle, and the follow-through strike caught the Tyrell boy across the shoulder and turned him halfway around. He held his ground, but his sword arm dropped 3 inches. Jon measured the drop and waited for it again. It came. Sansa was sitting with the Tyrell ladies in the east stand when the noise changed. She had been watching the joust, the knights' competition, which was what she had come to see, the formal beauty of it, the colors and the ceremony. Sir Loras Tyrell on his gray horse, with his armor like something from a song. The squire's melee was happening simultaneously at the field's southern end, and she had been tracking it in her peripheral vision without meaning to, the way you tracked movement without looking at it directly. But the crowd's attention had shifted. Not all of it, but enough. She turned. "Which one is that?" said the woman beside her. Lady Olenna Tyrell occupied her seat the way she occupied every seat, as though it had been placed there for her specific convenience, and the rest of the world had arranged itself accordingly. She was very old and very small, and her eyes missed nothing at all. She had accompanied Loras south from Highgarden for the tournament, with the stated purpose of seeing the capital and the actual purpose of seeing everything worth seeing in it before the season turned. She was looking at the south end of the field with the focused attention of someone who had spent 80 years in rooms full of people performing things, and could identify immediately when something unperformed was happening. Sansa looked at where Lady Olenna was looking. In the south corner, a dark-haired boy in plain practice leathers was doing something that the crowd had begun to locate and follow. He was not big, he was not performing. He moved through the remaining competitors with the specific economy of someone for whom the other fighters on the ground were a problem to be solved rather than a stage to be occupied, and he was solving it methodically, quietly, without waste. "That's—" Sansa started. She stopped. She was going to say Ned Stark's bastard, and something in her throat closed around it. She looked at Jon, at his face, which she had spent years in the same castle as and had been trained by her mother's example not to look at too directly, and watched him disarm the last of the dangerous opponents with a movement so efficient it was almost invisible. "My half-brother," Sansa said. The pride in her voice surprised her. She heard it after she had already spoken, could not retrieve it, and sat with the warmth of being slightly ashamed of it, and also beneath that, not willing to take it back. Lady Olenna looked at her, then looked back at Jon. "He fights like someone taught him that losing was worse than embarrassment," she said. "That's not a southern education." She tapped one gnarled finger against her armrest. "Bring him to me afterward." Robert presented the melee prize himself. It was a small silver medallion on a blue ribbon, the official prize, modest by tournament standards, the kind of thing you could win and hang above a mantel and visitors would ask about. Robert made it into something else. He crossed the field with the medallion in his fist, and the crowd's full attention following him, and he put his arm around Jon's shoulders and raised their joined hands and announced to the stands in a voice that had always been designed to carry across battlefields, "The North remembers how to fight." The crowd responded. The sound of it was large. Jon stood with Robert's arm across his shoulders and looked at nothing specific. His face was still. His hands were still. Inside the stillness there was a boy working through what the moment meant, and filing the answer in the careful place where he kept things that had become true before he was ready for them. Across the field, in the royal box, Joffrey was watching. He was watching his father's arm across Jon Snow's shoulders. He was watching the crowd's noise turn toward a bastard in borrowed leathers. He was watching Robert's face, the delight in it, the open, uncomplicated pride, the expression Joffrey had spent his entire life attempting to produce in that face, and had never quite managed, aimed at someone who was not him. He did not look away. He was not a boy who looked away from things he hated. Lady Olenna found Jon an hour later in the post-tournament gathering near the pavilions. He had been standing with a cup of something he wasn't drinking, watching the crowd with the habitual attention that had become so natural he was no longer aware he was doing it. She appeared in front of him with the directness of someone who had decided that walking around people was an inefficiency she had stopped tolerating sometime in the last decade. She looked at him. He looked at her. "You're taller than I expected," she said. "Sit down, I'm not going to strain my neck." They found a bench at the pavilion's edge. Lady Olenna settled herself with the patience of someone who had learned to move slowly without becoming slow, and studied Jon with eyes that were sharp enough to cut with. "You don't want anything from this tournament," she said. "Not a question. No, my lady. You don't want to be noticed. You don't want a crowd chanting your name. You don't want the king's arm around your shoulder. She tilted her head. And yet here you are with all three. How does a boy manage to acquire things he hasn't sought? Jon thought about this. By not seeking them, probably. Lady Olenna made a sound. Not quite a laugh too dry for that. Oh, you'll do, she said. You'll absolutely do. She looked at him steadily. You don't know what you are yet, do you, in this city? Jon said, I'm learning. Everyone in King's Landing says that, she said. Most of them are lying. You're not. She rose, done with the conversation in the way she was done with things, completely without transition. The Tyrells watch everything worth watching. We've been watching you since you arrived. She smoothed her skirts. Try not to get killed before you figure out what you are. It would be a waste. She walked away before he could answer. Jon looked after her and then looked across the field at Joffrey's pale, furious face. He tucked the silver medallion into his belt and went to find Ned. The invitation came written on paper so fine Jon could see light through it. Not a summons. Varys did not summon people. He was too careful with language for that, too aware of how words shaped the thing they described. It was a note, delivered by a small boy of perhaps 8, who appeared at Jon's door, handed it over without speaking, and was gone before Jon had finished reading it. The handwriting was beautiful, the kind that took years to develop, and the content was 3 sentences. Lord Varys would be grateful for a brief meeting at Jon's convenience, a small matter of household management regarding the training schedule, and Jon should not trouble himself if the timing was inconvenient. Whenever suited. Jon read it twice. The training schedule was Sir Barrisan's domain, and had nothing to do with Varys or his household. This was so obvious that the pretext was almost courteous. Varys was being polite enough to give him a fiction to travel under, which meant Varys had enough respect for his intelligence to assume he would see through it, which was itself a message. He went the next morning. Varys's apartments were in the lower residential wing, which surprised Jon. He had expected something more central, closer to the levers of things. The rooms themselves were modest in their furnishings, which also surprised him, and then he stopped being surprised by things in this room and started paying attention instead. The modesty was information. A man whose power came from knowing things other people didn't had no use for furniture that announced his importance. The importance was in the walls, in the air, in the very specific quality of quiet that the room possessed, the quiet of a space insulated from casual eavesdropping by layers of stone and arrangement that looked accidental. Varys was standing when Jon arrived, which was a courtesy. He was a round-faced man of indeterminate age, bald, soft in appearance in the way that things designed to seem unthreatening are soft, with small hands folded in front of him and eyes that performed warmth with the precision of a craftsman who has made the same object 10,000 times and can now make it perfectly without thinking about it. Jon, he said, how good of you to come. Please, sit. Jon sat. He placed his hands flat on his thighs and his back a half-inch from the chair's support and kept his face in the listening arrangement and waited. Varys sat across from him and talked. He talked about the training yard, the schedule, the rotations, a minor logistical point about Ser Barristan's preference for morning sessions. Jon answered each question with the minimum information required, and did not elaborate. Varys noted the non-elaboration with a slight brightness in his eyes that he did not attempt to conceal. A test being registered. He pivoted. The schedule was set aside. He asked Jon about the journey south, the road, the scenery, whether Jon had found King's Landing different from his expectations. Jon said it was larger. Varys laughed. The warm laugh that performed won and asked whether larger was better or simply larger. Jon said, I haven't decided. Varys looked at him. The warmth in his expression did not diminish, but something underneath it became more present. The actual attention, surfacing through the performance like a shape seen through shallow water. What do you want from this city? Varys asked. The question was casual. It was not a casual question. Jon held it for a moment. He had thought about this since his first night in the Sept. To understand it, he said, understanding. Varys seemed to taste the word. Not advancement. Not recognition. Not a small gesture suggesting a list he had decided not to complete. The things young men of your situation usually come here wanting. I'm not sure what my situation is, Jon said. I'm still mapping it. A pause. Varys looked at him with an expression that had not been there before, something that required more precision than warmth. You are remarkably honest, Varys said. For someone in a position that rewards dishonesty, honest people are harder to manipulate, Jon said. There's less distance between what they say and what they think. It's harder to find the gap. Silence. Brief, the kind of silence that registered something. Varys rose and moved to a small table by the window, where a carafe stood alongside 2 cups. He poured without asking. It was water, not wine, which Jon noted and did not comment on. "You are not what this city expected," Varys said. Jon took the cup. What did it expect? A pawn. Varys sat again, his own cup held in both small hands. Something the king would use for sentiment and the queen would remove for convenience. Something that would generate a brief disruption and then be managed. He looked at Jon with the precision fully present now, the warmth set aside like a tool put down. Instead, it received a listener. Jon said nothing. "Do you know what listeners find eventually in this city?" Varys asked. Jon held the silence. He understood in this moment that it was the correct response. Varys smiled. "Everything," he said. He let the words sit. Then, "That is not a warning. It is simply a fact. As I believe Lord Stannis might say, the name landed with the precision of a thrown object and Varys watched it land. The trick, with everything, is knowing what to do with it once you have it." Jon looked at him steadily. "And what do you do with it?" "I give it to people who use it well," Varys said. On occasion, he rose, which was the dismissal, done with perfect courtesy. "Thank you for coming, Jon. I'll speak to Sir Barristan about the scheduling matter." He smiled. The warmth was back, seamless, as if the previous 20 minutes had been an entirely different conversation. Jon rose. "Thank you for the water." He walked out. In the corridor he stopped. He stood against the stone wall and breathed for a moment. Not recovering, he had not been frightened exactly, recalibrating, letting the information settle into its correct positions rather than letting it move too fast. Varys knew about the library. That was the Stannis remark, too precisely placed to be general, which meant Varys knew about the meetings on the eastern battlements as well, because men like Varys did not know half a thing. He had known before Jon arrived. He had been watching Jon the way Jon had been watching King's Landing, methodically, from a distance, cataloging behavior and motive and capacity. And he had not moved against him. This was the thing. Varys had everything Pycelle had reported to Cersei, and more besides, and had sat on all of it, and had invited Jon in not to threaten him but to look at him directly and take his measure in person, which meant the calculation had already been made from a distance and had reached a conclusion that required confirmation rather than action. Jon stood in the corridor and worked backward from that. Varys served the realm. This was the thing people said about him, half mockingly, because it sounded like the kind of thing men said when they wanted a principle that justified any particular choice. But Jon had heard it said enough times in enough different contexts to suspect it was more specific than it sounded. Varys served stability. He moved toward arrangements he believed would hold and away from arrangements he believed would collapse. And he had been doing this across 3 reigns with enough success that the Red Keep was still standing. The question was what Varys saw in Jon Snow that made Jon worth protecting. And the answer Jon did not have yet, did not have the information to fully form, was assembling itself at the edges of his understanding anyway, piece by piece, the way the Baratheon hair pattern had assembled itself across the pages of the genealogy. Not a conclusion yet. A shape. He pushed off the wall and went to find Tyrion. Tyrion was in his rooms with a book and a bottle of Dornish red, which was his natural habitat. He looked up when Jon arrived, registered Jon's expression with the quick assessment of a man who read faces the way Jon read training yards, and set the book down. Jon gave him the meeting in careful edited terms, the pretext, the conversation's arc, the Stannis remark, the moment the warmth had moved aside. Tyrion listened without interrupting, which was unusual for Tyrion. When Jon finished, Tyrion poured a second cup and pushed it across the table and drank from his own for a moment. "He's decided you matter," Tyrion said. Jon waited. "That's either very good or very bad." Tyrion turned the cup in a slow circle on the table. "In Varys's case, the difference is usually timing." "What does that mean?" Tyrion looked at him. "It means he's decided you'll outlast the current arrangement." He paused. "The question is whether the arrangement ends well or badly for everyone else." He said everyone else with the particular flatness of someone naming something they were not ready to name directly. Jon looked at him across the table. Neither of them spoke for a moment. In the room's firelight, Tyrion's mismatched eyes were unreadable, which was its own kind of answer, and Jon's hands were flat on the table in the way they were flat when he was keeping them still deliberately. They both knew what the arrangement meant. They both knew what everyone else covered. The Lannisters, Joffrey, The succession built on a false foundation that Stannis and Ned and Jon and now apparently Varys all knew was false, held in place by Cersei's will and Robert's obliviousness and the specific reluctance of everyone who knew to be the first to say it where it could not be taken back. Jon said, "How long does it hold?" Tyrion drank. "Things like this hold until they don't." He set the cup down, and then they come apart very quickly. He looked at the fire. The question worth asking, the one Varys is asking, I'd imagine, is not how long it holds, it's who's standing where when it stops. Jon said nothing. He picked up the cup Tyrion had pushed toward him and held it without drinking, the way he held things he was thinking about rather than consuming, and stared at the middle distance while King's Landing conducted its night outside the window. Who was standing where? He put the cup down, he said goodnight to Tyrion and walked back through the corridors toward his own rooms, taking the longer route through the eastern passage, the one that ran past Varys's door at the far end, past the section of wall where the small boy who delivered the note had appeared from and disappeared into, past the stones that hid whatever was behind them in a building that had been built and rebuilt and extended over generations until its architecture held more secrets than its inhabitants. He walked past all of it and let it look at him and looked back at it and went to bed. He slept without difficulty. He was beginning to understand the city. The forest south of King's Landing smelled nothing like the Wolf's Wood. Jon had not expected it to, but the difference was still something his body registered before his mind had words for it. The Wolf's Wood was cold pine and old earth, and the clean bite of northern air that had been cold long enough to become honest. The King's Wood was warmer, heavier, the trees different in species and in temperament, broadleaf and oak, the canopy thicker and lower, the undergrowth dense with bracken that caught at a horse's legs and made movement deliberate. The light came through in columns rather than the flat gray sheet he had grown up in. It was beautiful. It was also close in the way of places that did not give you distance to see what was coming. He rode 3 horses behind Robert in the main party. This was normalized now, his position near the front, near the king, near the men Robert chose to ride with rather than the men who rode with him because their rank required it. 6 months had moved Jon from the novelty of a ward newly arrived to a fixed point in the king's daily geography. Robert looked for him in the morning yard. He told Jon stories that he did not tell other people. The stories without glory in them, the ones from the rebellion that involved mistakes rather than victories. Jon listened to all of them with the same quality of attention and said the right things and did not, as Robert seemed half afraid he might, look disappointed by the truth of things. Robert trusted him. Jon had thought in the first weeks that this was a simple thing, the king's love as a shield, something to stand behind. 6 months had taught him it was more complicated. Trust was not just a shield. It was also an obligation. It had weight. He rode and watched the King's Wood and noted, as he always noted, who was near whom and what their bodies were doing. They made camp at midday near a stream that came off the ridge, clear and cold, surprisingly cold for the south. The dogs were quartering the ground ahead where the beaters had driven deer sign, and the huntsmen were managing the horses while the main party watered and ate and drank in the easy sprawl of men who had been riding since dawn. Robert was in a good mood. He was always in a good mood in forests, away from the court's weight, away from Cersei and the small council and the endless paperwork of a realm that required managing. He ate standing, talked about a hunt he'd been on in the Stormlands 20 years ago, laughed at his own story before he'd finished telling it. The knights around him laughed with him, and Jon watched the ease of it. How completely Robert shed the kingship in these moments, how much he preferred the man he'd been before the crown. Lancel Lannister was managing Robert's wineskin. This was his function as squire, to attend, to carry, to ensure the king had what he needed. Lancel was 16, fair-haired in the Lannister way, recently assigned to the position. Jon had noticed him in the first week, catalogued him and filed him under peripheral. Not significant enough to watch closely, not dangerous, not interesting. He was a boy doing a boy's job in a court full of people doing important things. He revised this now. It was not a dramatic thing that drew his attention. There was no sudden movement, no furtive look over his shoulder. It was simply that Jon was watching the camp the way he always watched spaces, with the lateral attention that took everything in without directing itself. And Lancel's hands were wrong. He was filling the king's wineskin from a skin that was not the one he had been carrying. The replacement skin was darker in color, not dramatically, not enough to announce itself. The kind of difference you noticed because you were already looking. Lancel's hands moved with the specific deliberateness of someone managing a practiced action while managing their own face simultaneously. Both things. Not one, the split attention of guilt. Jon looked at Robert. He was still talking, the story nearly finished, the punchline arriving. He drank from the cup a page had brought him, the standard cup, not the wineskin not yet presented. Jon moved. He did not run, he did not call out. He crossed the camp with the specific unhurried purpose of someone carrying out a minor task that had occurred to him, which was the only way to cross a camp with 20 witnesses, when you were doing something that needed no witnesses. He came up beside Lancel at the moment Lancel was recapping the skin. Their eyes met. Lancel's face went through three things very quickly: recognition, confusion, then the beginning of something pale and frightened that he did not have time to complete because Jon was already talking. "I'll take that to him," Jon said. Quiet, pleasant, the tone of one attendant speaking to another about a logistics matter. "The king mentioned the vintage was light this morning. There's something stronger at the supply cart." He held out his hand. Lancel looked at the skin in his own hands, then at Jon, then at Robert, 20 feet away, still talking. Jon waited with his hand extended and his face showing nothing at all. Lancel gave him the skin. Jon walked to the supply cart at the camp's edge, set the dark skin down behind a wheel where it would not be immediately visible, took the standard supply skin, and returned to where Robert was finishing his story. He presented it without comment. Robert took it and drank without looking at what he was drinking. Done. Jon walked back to his horse and checked the saddle straps that did not need checking, and breathed through his nose for a moment. The boar came at mid-afternoon. It came from the bracken on the western side of the trail, a full-grown male, black and massive, and moving with the direct and committed intent of something that did not have the cognitive architecture for doubt. Robert heard it before he saw it, the crash of undergrowth, and by the time it broke cover he was already off his horse with a boar spear in his hand, because whatever the court had made him, the memory of how to do this lived somewhere below thought. He fought it badly and well simultaneously. Badly because he was not 25 anymore, because the weight he was carrying slowed his lateral movement, because he committed to an angle too early, and the boar caught his forearm with a tusk before the spear went in. The wound was a deep scrape, blood soaking through the sleeve, sharp, not deep enough to be fatal, painful enough to get a roar out of Robert that sent two horses sideways. Well, because he put the spear through the boar's neck on the third exchange with the calm of a man who had done this many times and knew the geometry of it in his sleep, the boar went down. Robert stood over it, bleeding and laughing. The huntsmen converged. 3 knights were already off their horses. Someone was calling for the maester. Robert waved all of it off and said something about needing better wine and worse odds, and looked around the camp with the particular look of a man who wanted to share the moment with someone specific. He found Jon and grinned. Jon felt something ease in his chest that he had not known was tightened. Camp was made permanent for the evening. The boar dressed and spitted over a fire that turned it slowly, the smell of it moving through the trees. Robert's arm was cleaned and wrapped by the maester who had ridden with them. 4 stitches, Robert not flinching for any of them. Cersei arrived with the secondary party an hour later. She had ridden separately, as she sometimes did on hunts, with her ladies and her own escort. She came through the tree line into the clearing, and her eyes went to Robert immediately, as they always did, reading the room's information in the single scan that Jon had come to recognize as her specific skill. Robert was alive, injured, bandaged, loud, drinking. What crossed her face lasted less than a second. It was not relief. Jon was watching. He was always watching, and he saw it. The sequence of it, the information received, the response assembled, the response checked and corrected and replaced with something appropriate. Relief constructed rather than felt. She crossed to Robert and took his bandaged arm and said something warm and worried about his recklessness, and Robert laughed and kissed her temple, and the performance was perfect. Jon looked away. He stood at the fire's edge and looked at the boar turning on its spit and held what he had seen in the careful place where he kept things before he understood what to do with them. Not relief. She had expected something different. She had ridden into this camp expecting something different and had found Robert alive and had spent 1 fraction of a second unable to conceal the adjustment. Jon thought about the dark skin, about Lancel's hands, about the specific quality of Lancel's frightened silence when Jon had taken the skin from him without asking. He thought about Tyrion's voice saying things come apart very quickly. He thought about Varys saying who's standing where when it stops. He thought about all of it for a long time, until the boar was ready, and then he went and ate with the hunting party and said nothing to anyone and waited for the right time. He went to Ned's tent after the camp was mostly quiet. The fire was low. Jory Castle was outside, which meant Ned had expected someone. Jon pushed through the tent flap and Ned was sitting with a cup he wasn't drinking, which was the thing Ned did when he was thinking rather than resting. Jon sat across from him. He told it in the order it had happened: the wineskin, Lancel's hams, the replacement, the boar, Cersei's face in the clearing. He told it plainly and without interpretation, the way Ned had taught him to report things. The fact first, the meaning held separately, the two not collapsed into each other before there was ground for it. Ned listened with absolute stillness. He did not speak for a moment after Jon had finished. The fire crackled. Outside, a horse shifted and stamped. "You did well," Ned said. Quiet. Something in his voice that Jon couldn't fully place. Not surprise, not exactly, but something that had been compressed for a long time and was releasing a fraction. "I don't know what I stopped," Jon said. Ned looked at him. "Yes, you do." A long pause. "Stay close to me tomorrow," Ned said. Jon looked at his uncle's face. The still face, the honorable face, the face that had been carrying a secret for 14 years, and understood from the specific quality of those 5 words that something had changed. Not the situation, not the facts. Something in Ned himself. Some internal gate held shut by the instinct to protect, opening by an increment. He was not protecting Jon from King's Landing anymore, he was preparing him for it. The difference between those two things was everything. Jon said, "All right." He went back to his own tent and lay in the dark and listened to the Kingswood settle into its nighttime register. Insects, wind, the distant bark of something far off in the trees. He thought about the skin behind the cartwheel. He had not told anyone about that yet. He needed to tell Ned tomorrow, in full. He thought about Cersei's face. 1 second. Less than 1 second. Jon Snow, 6 months into King's Landing, 14 years old, closed his eyes in a forest that smelled nothing like home and understood that the hunt had not been about the boar. It had never been about the boar. Ned laid the evidence out on his desk the way he had once laid out maps before a battle. Not because it required the desk. He had all of it in his head. Had always had all of it. Had been carrying it since before Jon Arryn's body was cold. He laid it out because the physical arrangement helped him see it as Robert would need to see it. Not as a conclusion, but as a sequence, one stone placed after another until the structure they formed was unavoidable. The great book first. The relevant pages marked not with parchment this time, but with Ned's own handwriting in the margins. Dates, names, the hair color recorded in christening registrations, and Maester's notes across 4 generations of Baratheon blood. The pattern written out in a hand that was not Jon Arryn's and not Jon Snow's, and could not be dismissed as the fantasy of a boy or the obsession of a dead man. Beside it, a list. Robert's bastards in the city, 9 of them, with their mothers' names and their ages and the single physical fact that mattered. All black-haired. All carrying the Baratheon stamp like a letter sealed shut. Ned had seen them himself, had walked Jon through 3 of them in the city's streets in the 2nd month, and the living evidence of the pattern was more persuasive than any written record. Then Jon's account of the Kingswood. Written down at Ned's request in Jon's precise hand, dated, witnessed by Jory Cassell, the dark wineskin, Lancel's hands, the replacement, what he had seen on Cersei's face when she rode into camp and found Robert with a bandaged arm instead of a boar's tusk through his chest. Stannis stood against the far wall with his arms at his sides and said nothing. He had read everything. He had contributed his own findings in a meeting that had lasted 2 hours and contained across both of them perhaps 600 words. This was how Stannis operated in spaces where he trusted the people present. He said the necessary things and then he stopped, which Jon had come to understand was the highest form of respect Stannis knew how to offer. Jory Cassell stood at the door. The door was locked. Jon was seated at the desk's edge, not looking at the papers, looking at Ned. "Today?" Ned said. Stannis said, "Yes." Jon said nothing. He turned the piece of information over. "Today?" and felt it settle into the place where things that had been coming became things that had arrived. Robert's apartments were at the keep's highest residential level, the windows looking south over the bay. Ned had requested a private audience through a channel that bypassed Cersei's household entirely, through Sir Barristan, who had not asked why and had arranged it within the hour. Barristan was not an ally in any formal sense. He was simply a man who had served kings for 40 years and could read rooms, and the rooms of the Red Keep had been telling him something for months. Robert was at the window when they entered, Ned first, then Stannis. Jon remained outside with Jory and the household guard, which was Ned's decision, and Jon had not argued with it. He stood in the corridor and waited. He could not hear the conversation. The door was solid oak, and Ned had closed it. What he could hear, after perhaps 10 minutes of nothing, was Robert's voice raised once. A single word at volume, the shape of the sound punching through the wood without the content. And then quiet again, and then a longer quiet. And then Stannis's voice, even and flat, saying something for approximately 30 seconds that Jon could not decode. Then nothing for a long time. Jory stood beside Jon and said nothing. The corridor held its cold and its torchlight and the distant sounds of a castle going about its mourning. The door opened. Robert was not the man who had ridden south from Winterfell. That man had been loud and ruined and fundamentally alive in the way of people who had never genuinely considered their own end. This man's face was drained in a specific way, not of color, which had always been high in him, but of the performance underneath the color. The noise he used to fill spaces with, it was gone. He looked like someone who had been told a true thing that reorganized everything behind it. He looked at Jon briefly, just briefly, then past him, down the corridor, at the keep's stone walls. "Do it quietly," Robert said. His voice was even, low. "I don't want a spectacle, not yet." He looked at Ned. "You have men?" "Yes. Use them." He went back inside and closed the door himself, and the sound of it closing was very deliberate. The Lannister wing was on the second level, east side. They moved in two groups, Ned's northern guard in front with Jon, Stannis's cultivated gold cloaks taking the lower corridor to close the secondary exit. The gold cloaks were Stannis's careful work over months, identified one by one, men whose loyalty sat with their oath rather than with whoever was currently paying above the standard rate. 8 of them. Ned's guard numbered a dozen of his most trusted men. Fewer than he could have brought, enough for an arrest if there was no resistance, and if the resistance, when it came from only one direction. The numbers were sufficient if Jaime Lannister did not draw. If he drew, the numbers were a different question entirely. Jon carried a sword, a real one. Ned had given it to him that morning without explanation, a straightforward weapon, nothing ceremonial, and Jon had belted it on and not said anything about the significance of it. They reached the corridor outside Jaime's apartments. Jaime was already in the corridor. He was in partial armor, breastplate, bracers, the white cloak over it, the sword at his hip. Whether he had been coming or going or simply standing there because he had felt something shift in the keep's geometry that morning was unclear, and did not matter. He saw Ned and his guard and Jon and read the entire scene in the time it took to read it, which was not long. His face did something brief and complicated that resolved into a kind of tired clarity. His hand went to the sword hilt. Jon watched his eyes, not his hand. The hand was information. He had learned this from Barristan. The eyes moved to Ned, then to the guardsman, then to Jon. They stayed on Jon for a moment that was longer than a tactical assessment required. Jon stood with his hand at his own hilt and his feet in the correct position and his face empty, and met Jaime Lannister's gaze without filling it. Jaime had said to him in a corridor 3 months ago, "Being the best fighter in King's Landing won't protect you from King's Landing." Jon had not forgotten. He thought about that now, and then he thought about whether Jaime was thinking about it too. Whether the sight of this particular boy in this corridor, with a sword he could actually use, was saying something to Jaime that the numbers and the guardsmen were not saying. That it had cost something to bring Jon here. That it would cost something if Jon did not walk out. Jaime's hand left the hilt. He did not draw. He did not step back. He stood in the corridor with his arms at his sides and his chin level and his jaw tight, which was Jaime's specific version of a man swallowing something that required swallowing. And he looked past Ned toward the wall. "I yield," Jaime said. The word was flat, entirely without performance. Not defeat. Jaime did not perform defeat any more than he performed humility. Simply a decision, announced. He did not kneel. He stood. Ned had expected the kneel. Jon could see the brief pause in Ned, the question of whether to require it. Ned let it go. The distinction mattered to Jaime, and Ned was not a man who required symbols from a man who had already surrendered the substance. The gold cloaks came forward. Jaime did not resist them. He looked at Jon once more as they moved him past. The look had something in it that Jon recognized but couldn't fully name, something like the expression Barristan had worn after the Rhaegar sword technique, the sense of a recognition that the recognizer was not ready to speak. Then he was past, and the corridor moved forward. Cersei was seated. This was the thing that marked the difference between them. Jaime had been in the corridor, in armor, in motion, or ready for it, the physical expression of a man who faced things by meeting them. Cersei was in her chair by the window of her solar, in a gown that had been carefully chosen, and a face that had been carefully arranged, and the arrangement was not the warmth she had shown Jon in their first meeting. It was something older than warmth, something that required more precision. She looked at Ned when they entered, then at the gold cloaks, then at Jon. She looked at Jon for a moment. "You," she said, not rage, not pleading, not the performance of innocence that a lesser tactician would have assembled. She said it with the specific quality of a woman who had spent 6 months assessing a variable, and had arrived in this moment at the understanding that she had assigned it the wrong weight. Jon said nothing. Cersei rose. She was magnificent in the way of things that do not diminish under pressure, the bearing unchanged, the posture unchanged, the green eyes holding what they held without letting it spill. She walked to the center of the room and stopped and held her wrists out toward the gold cloaks with a composure that was the most controlled thing Jon had ever witnessed. She did not look at Jon again. She had said the thing she had to say. The gold cloaks moved forward. Ned stood in the solar doorway and looked at his hands briefly, the way men look at the instruments of things they have done. Then he looked up and out at King's Landing through Cersei's window. The city going about its morning, the rooftops, the smoke, the bay beyond it all, the sun off the water. Jon stood beside him. The corridor outside was quiet. The gold cloak's footsteps faded. "It's done," Ned said. Jon looked at his uncle's face. It was not a triumphant face. It had the specific quality of a face that had completed a long piece of work and found, on the other side of it, not relief but the larger shape of what came next. Ned was right. It was done. And the largest thing was still waiting. Robert was alone when the page brought Jon in. No king's guard at the interior door. No stewards at the desk. The solar had been cleared in the specific way that important rooms are cleared, not emptied of its furniture or its fire, but of the human machinery that usually occupied it, the attendants and advisors and witnesses that transformed a room into an office. What remained was Robert Baratheon in a chair by the window, in riding clothes he had not changed out of, with a cup on the table beside him that appeared full. He had not been drinking. This was the first thing Jon noted. He noted it and said nothing and closed the distance between the door and the chair across from Robert, and sat when Robert gestured at the chair. The city was visible through the window, mid-morning, the sun off the bay, King's Landing doing what it always did. Robert looked at Jon for a long time. Not the assessing look of the yard or the feast hall warmth, or the particular gaze he used when he was about to tell a story from the rebellion. Something else. Something that had been stripped of its usual instruments and was working with what was underneath. "You're a hard boy to hate," Robert said. Jon looked at him. "I want you to know I tried." Robert's voice was even, which cost him something. Jon could see the cost of it in the set of his jaw. "When Ned first brought you to me in that yard, I looked at your face and I tried to see the bastard's inconvenience, the shadow on a friend's honor, something I could ignore." He picked up the cup, set it down without drinking. I couldn't do it. Jon said nothing. He held the stillness that had always been his instrument, and let Robert speak. "I'm going to legitimize you," Robert said. "Jon Stark of Winterfell, true-born name, true-born standing, everything the crown can give you by letter." He looked at Jon steadily. "I want you to have a name that fits what you are." The word legitimate settled into Jon's chest. He had spent 14 years as a bastard, not suffering it exactly, but organized around it, every room arranged at the angle that a bastard arranged rooms. A name that was not Snow. He sat with it for a moment. He said, "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," Robert said. "There's something—" The door opened. Ned entered the way he entered rooms when he had decided something, without hesitation, without performance, with the specific quality of a man who has finished an argument with himself and arrived at the other side. He looked at Robert, then at Jon. The look he gave Jon lasted 1 second and carried more information than a minute's speech, and Jon read it the way he had learned to read Ned's silences in 14 years of being raised by a man who communicated most honestly when he said nothing. "This is the moment. There is no more time." "Ned," Robert said. Not a greeting, a recognition of what Ned's face was doing. "There is something I have to tell you," Ned said. He pulled the chair from the desk's edge, placed it between them, sat in it, no preamble, no diplomatic architecture. This was Ned at his most Ned. The truth is a flat thing, handed over without ornament, because ornament would be a form of cowardice. He said, "I lied to you 14 years ago and every day since." Robert was very still. Ned told it simply. He always told things simply, which was its own kind of courage, the refusal to soften with language what could not be softened, the Tower of Joy, The Three Kings Guard. The fight. Howland Reed's blade finding Arthur Dayne's side. 6 men going up the tower stairs and 2 coming down. What the stairs smelled like. What they found at the top. Lyanna in a bed of blood. The roses, blue winter roses, the ones he had given her, already dying. Her face, what her face looked like at the end. The specific way she held his hand. The promise she extracted from him in the last minutes while her breath was going shallow and the light was failing and he was the only person in the world who could give her what she needed. Promise me, Ned. Robert had not moved. He was not a man who went still easily. He was constitutionally noise and motion. Rooms were never quite the same size when he was in them, but he was still now, with the absolute quality of something that has been struck and has not yet determined whether it will stand or fall. Ned said, Rhaegar did not take her. A sound from Robert. Not a word. Something beneath words. She went with him, Ned said. They were married in secret. A septon performed the ceremony somewhere in the south. Lyanna told me herself, in those last hours, with the last of her breath. He did not pause. I cannot tell you who else was witness, or whether anyone was. I know only what she told me. I believe her. I have always believed her. He looked at Robert. The child was legitimate. He was their son, Rhaegar's son. A breath, and Lyanna's. Silence. Jon sat against the window, and the city made its noise behind him, and the fire made its noise, and the room made no other noise at all. Robert looked at the cup on the table. He did not pick it up. He looked at it the way you look at a fixed point when the world around the point has become unreliable, using it to locate himself, to maintain a position, while everything else moved. Rhaegar. The name did not need to be spoken. It was in the room. It had been in the room since Ned began speaking, and now it had settled into the air and was not leaving. Robert's jaw worked once. He pressed his teeth together, and the muscle in his cheek moved, and he breathed through his nose. A long, deliberate breath. Jon knew this breath. He had learned it from watching men in training yards reach the moment when pain and pride were fighting each other for command of the body. She chose him, Robert said. Not a question. Flat. The words of a man placing a stone down to look at it. Yes, Ned said. Another silence. It was a different silence from the first. The first had been shock, the sharp intake of a system receiving information it was not built to receive. This one was grief working, moving through channels that had been worn deep over 17 years of use, finding the shapes they already knew, the ones that had always been about Lyanna, and being redirected into them by new information that changed what they meant without changing their size. Robert had always grieved Lyanna as a thing taken from him. This was different. This was a woman who had made a choice, who had looked at the life being arranged for her and had found another one and gone toward it with her own feet, who had loved a man Robert could not separate from his hatred, who had died for it or adjacent to it, and had sent her son into the world with a secret stitched around him like armor. Jon sat very still. He was watching Robert's face because there was nothing else to watch, and he needed to know. Robert looked up. He looked at Jon, and there it was. The thing that had always been there that Robert had worn in his face every time he looked at Jon without knowing why it was there. It was readable now in the light of what Ned had said. Jon had Lyanna's stillness, her gray eyes and her quality of watching without announcing the watching. Robert had loved those things in Jon instinctively, blindly, the way you love things that echo something irreplaceable. Those things were Lyanna's, and the jaw beneath them, the slight forward set of the brow, the way Jon sat in a chair, a particular angle, a particular readiness that had nothing to do with how Stark sat. Robert looked at it and knew, now, what it was. He closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, he said, "Does the boy know?" "He does now," Ned said. Robert looked at Jon. "You knew. Before today, not all of it," Jon said. "I knew enough. Enough." Robert's voice turned the word over. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, and looked at the floor between his boots. The posture of a man thinking rather than performing thought. He stayed there for a long time. Jon waited. "Rhaegar," Robert said again. The name was different this time, not the flat stone of the first time. Textured. Something moving inside it that Robert was not willing to display, but could not entirely suppress. "Gods?" A breath. "I killed him, and his seed is sitting in my solar, and I've spent a year loving." He stopped. He looked at Jon. Jon met it. He kept his hands still and his face steady, and let Robert see what was there. Not a dragon, not a ghost, not Rhaegar's ghost and not Lyanna's ghost. A boy who had grown up in the north, who had trained in yards before dawn, Who had read genealogies and walked battlements with Stannis, and sat across from Varys, and taken a wineskin from a frightened squire in a forest, and carried it quietly to a cartwheel, and not told anyone until it mattered? Jon Snow, whatever else he was. Robert looked at him for a long time. "The legitimization stands," Robert said. His voice was rough. "Jon Stark of Winterfell." He paused. "That is one name." He looked at Ned, then back. "You understand me." Jon understood. "I understand," he said. The Godswood was quiet. There were no weirwood trees in King's Landing. The Andals had cut them centuries ago. But the Godswood still existed, a small acre of garden in the keep's southeast corner, maintained for the northern members of the court who kept the old faith. The trees were wrong, the wrong species, the wrong age, the wrong smell. But the ground was quiet and the sky was open, and Jon went there after dark when he needed to think without being interrupted. Ned found him there, or knew to look. They sat on the stone bench that faced the small pool at the garden's center. The water reflected the stars imperfectly. Neither of them spoke for a while. Jon said, "Why did you wait?" Ned was quiet. "Because you needed to become someone who could hear it," he said. "And because he paused, needed to see what you were before he knew what you came from, if he'd known from the beginning. The moment he saw you in that yard, he stopped. He would have put the name Rhaegar between himself and everything he felt. He would have never let himself." He stopped again. Jon said, "You used me." Ned turned to look at him. "Not cruelly," Jon said. "I'm not saying cruelly." He looked at the pool. "But you needed him to love me before he knew. You needed the love to already exist. So you waited." Ned said yes. The word cost him something. "I'm not angry," Jon said. And then, quieter, "I don't know what I am." "That's honest," Ned said. "It will take time." "Both names," Jon said. He said both names. "Yes." "That's—" Jon stopped. He looked at the water. The stars moved slightly in the pool's surface, disturbed by some current Jon couldn't see. He thought about the Wolf's Wood, about Ghost, left behind, about Robb's hand on his arm under the feast table on the night Robert announced it, about the name Snow, which had been a cold name, a nothing name, a name that meant, born of somewhere we won't name, and what it meant that there were two other names beneath it, waiting. "I'm still me," Jon said. He was not entirely sure who he was saying it to. Ned put his hand on Jon's shoulder. The weight of it was familiar. The same weight it had always been. His father's hand, the hand of the man who had raised him and lied for him and loved him in the careful northern way that did not announce itself. "Yes," Ned said, "you are." They sat in the quiet Godswood under the wrong trees and said nothing else. The city breathed around them. The stars moved in the pool. Jon Snow, Jon Stark, Aegon Targaryen, the boy raised by a lie and made true by it anyway, sat with his father in the dark and let the names settle into him one by one, and did not look away from any of them. Let us know what you'd like to see next. The end.